In a dimly lit room in Geneva, Theodore Beza sat at a wooden desk, his quill scratching furiously across a parchment. It was 1552, and the air was thick with tension. Outside, the streets were quiet, but Beza knew that the world of books was anything but peaceful. He was writing a letter to Heinrich Bullinger, a friend and fellow reformer in Zurich, explaining the precarious state of the Genevan book industry. "Dear Bullinger," Beza began, "the situation here is dire. French books, especially those of our faith, are becoming scarce. They can hardly be bought for hard cash in these areas, but our printers have found a way. They trust a few brave men to secretly spread these booklets among the French churches. These men risk their lives every day if they are caught with the books. They lose their lives for the name of Christ." Beza paused, his thoughts heavy. The last sentence seemed almost cynical, but the reality was harsh. The printers were worried about losing their business, but the peddlers were the ones who paid with their lives. Beza felt a pang of guilt, but he knew the importance of spreading the word. The Edict of Chateaubriand, promulgated in 1551, had made things worse. It banned the import of any book from Geneva and other Protestant lands. The edict also required that all publications include the author's name and publishing information. This meant that any book without these details could be considered suspicious, and confiscated Genevan printers had to adapt. They started printing books without stating the city's name. Some even used false addresses. For example, a Bible might claim to be printed in Avignon or Lyon when it was actually produced in Geneva. This hide-and-seek game was risky but necessary. One of the most daring printers was Crespin. In 1552, he published a Bible that claimed to be printed in Avignon by Jehan Daniel. He also produced a prayer book that purported to be from Lyon. In 1556 and 1557, he published 5 works in Spanish, each claiming to be from Venice. Some of these books even carried Calvin's name, though he was cautious about it. For instance, a work called De Statu Primitive Ecclesiae by François Horman had a hybrid printer's address, Hierapoli apud Joe Crispinum. Calvin himself was not immune to the challenges. In 1547, he suggested printing his excuse in Geneva, but without the city's name on the title page. The first print run bore the name of Wendell in Strasbourg, a tactic that upset the Strasbourg authorities. Calvin had to modify the initial and final booklets to placate them. The Genevan Council was strict about false addresses, but allowed the omission of the city's name if a publication was deemed politically dangerous. In 1553, the consistory reprimanded Vigian and Duchesne for printing almanacs with a false Lyon address. In 1555, Jacques Poulain was reprimanded for the same offense and had to correct the faulty copies. Despite the risks, the Genevan booksellers established a network to distribute these books. Laurent de Normandie, one of the leading figures in the Protestant book trade in France, was a close friend of Calvin. Laurent and his associates faced constant danger, but they were determined to spread the Reformation's message. The world of books in Geneva was a dangerous, clandestine affair. Printers, booksellers, and peddlers risked everything to share the word. Beza's letter to Bullinger was just one small part of a much larger, ongoing struggle. But for those involved, the cause was worth the risk. Their lives and the future of the Reformation depended on it. Calvin was a very busy man. His days were packed with sermons, lectures, and meetings. He preached twice on Sundays, and every other weekday morning. He also gave lectures on the Bible every other week, which lasted about an hour. On top of all this, he attended meetings of the consistory on Thursdays and the congregations on Fridays. He was always dealing with church matters, from small issues to big decisions. Despite his busy schedule, Calvin found time to write. Sometimes he wrote letters by hand, but as his health declined, he often dictated to his secretaries. He would try to write in the early morning, but his open door meant he was often interrupted. However, his excellent memory helped him pick up where he left off. His friend Colladon noted that Calvin had a remarkable memory which helped him manage both his church duties and his scholarly work. Calvin worked quickly and often under pressure. He would write polemical responses in just a few days, and often waited until the last minute to write dedications or prepare for lectures. He revised his earlier works frequently, adding new insights and reflections. His Institutes, for example, went through several editions, each time becoming more comprehensive. Calvin was also an avid reader. He read both classical and contemporary works, from medieval scholastic texts to the writings of other reformers like Luther and Bucer. He used these readings to strengthen his arguments and enrich his own writings. Despite his wide reading, he was known for his clarity and conciseness. Unlike many of his contemporaries who wrote in a meandering style, Calvin's writing was straightforward and well-structured. Calvin was hesitant to have his sermons published because he felt they were too wordy and lacked the polish of his written works. He believed in the distinction between spoken and written discourse, and he wanted his published works to be clear and well organized. Choosing a language to write in was a challenge for Calvin. At first, he wrote in Latin, even for those who were not well educated. But by the 1540s, he recognized the importance of writing in French to reach a broader audience. He translated his Institutes into French and even considered writing commentaries in French, though he often left this task to others. Calvin was deeply involved in the world of publishing. He understood the printing process and often visited printing shops. However, he was not always meticulous about proofreading, relying on his secretaries to help with this task. He trusted printers like Robert Estienne and Conrad Badius, who produced high-quality editions of his works. Calvin was also aware of the importance of book distribution and maintained close relationships with booksellers. Calvin's influence extended beyond his own writing. He played a role in censorship and encouraged printers to produce works that aligned with Reformed theology. He was consulted on many books and often intervened to correct errors or superstitions. While he delegated some responsibilities, his presence in the book world was significant. He was a key figure in the spread of Reformed ideas, both through his own works and through his support of others. Calvin's life was a balance of scholarly work and practical church leadership. His ability to manage both roles, despite the constant demands on his time, is a testament to his dedication and skill. His writings continue to be studied and admired for their clarity and depth, reflecting the influence of his extensive reading and his commitment to the Reformation. Compared to other leading figures of his day, Calvin's knowledge of the printing industry was not exceptional. Well-known authors such as Erasmus and Luther were very familiar with printers and actively used printing technology to spread their ideas widely. In contrast, Ignatius of Loyola, who was more than 20 years younger than Erasmus and about 8 years younger than Luther, had a more medieval approach. Loyola and his companions relied on preaching, private conversations, and letters to spread their message. Although Loyola's conversion came through reading books, he never wrote any himself. Only one Latin edition of his Spiritual Exercises was published in 1548. Later, when the Jesuits started focusing on educating young people, Loyola aimed to provide inexpensive texts for their schools. He even planned to set up a printing press at the Roman College in 1556. Clearly, Printed books were not a major concern for Loyola initially, but the Jesuits did start to focus on printing by the end of the 16th century. Erasmus, Luther, and Calvin were all very aware of the technical and financial aspects of printing. They chose their printers carefully, often working with humanists who understood both the printing process and the content of their works. However, there were differences among them. Erasmus was not a pastor and did not establish a church, though he had many followers. He strongly supported translating the Bible into vernacular languages, but wrote his own works in Latin. He worked with high-quality printers in major cities like Venice, Basel, Antwerp, and Louvain. Erasmus and his friends used printing effectively, especially in their conflicts with opponents. For example, Erasmus managed to keep his adversary Edward Lee out of the main printing houses in the Netherlands. Both Calvin and Luther established churches and used their native languages extensively. Their work attracted high-caliber printers to Wittenberg and Geneva. However, the fragmented nature of the German states meant that many printers in different cities helped spread Luther's ideas. This sometimes made it harder for Luther to control the quality of his works, as poorly printed copies could distort his message. Luther was more likely to link oral communication with writing. Many of his works were sermons and academic lectures. He often wrote in response to specific events and had strong opinions about the social role of books. Luther believed that books should serve different purposes: scholarly books for leaders in church and state, and simpler books for ordinary people. Luther's famous statement that printing is God's final and greatest gift is often repeated, but he also complained about the many bad books. Calvin also had concerns about the abundance of poor-quality books. Calvin's writing was divided between exegetical texts and polemical tracts. His biblical commentaries were part of a large project. He began in 1538, working on them whenever he had time. His polemical works, on the other hand, were written in response to specific events. Calvin's opponents varied in importance to him, and his mood influenced his writing. For instance, he sometimes wrote enthusiastically, while at other times he felt disgusted by his opponents. Calvin's biblical commentaries were closely tied to his teaching. He lectured at the academy and led Friday congregations, where his commentaries were often recorded and published. He studied the Bible intensely, reading French translations, preaching sermons, and giving lectures. The Institutes of the Christian Religion was Calvin's core work, which he focused on throughout his career. It contained the essence of his pastoral and theological views, and he rarely deleted any part of it. His writing output increased over time, especially between 1550 and 1557, despite political struggles in Geneva. His health decline in his later years affected his writing, but he remained productive until the end. Calvin's sense of calling underpinned everything he did. He saw himself as a servant of the truth, whether preaching, writing commentaries, or engaging in political matters. He believed that his authority came from God, which sometimes made him intolerant in his polemical writings. He was humble in acknowledging that his authority was not his own, but he was also firm in his beliefs. Calvin's approach to Scripture was scholarly, combining humanist philological methods with scholastic tradition. He emphasized the importance of sermons and Bible translations, seeing himself as an interpreter who could help the masses understand the Scriptures. His interpretations were guided by his theological insights, and he often drew doctrines and ethical principles from the Bible. Calvin's interactions with other reformers, like Bullinger, sometimes involved political considerations. He was willing to make compromises to avoid conflict and would take control of situations that could harm his cause. Despite his self-criticism for laziness and inertia, Calvin accomplished a tremendous amount. His writing was often motivated by external factors, such as requests from friends or reactions to events. Calvin relied on the support of close friends and colleagues, even though he was a dominant figure. He would often seek feedback from friends like Farel, Viret, and Beza before publishing his works. This collaborative approach helped him refine his ideas and maintain high standards. Ernst Walter Zeiden noted that Calvin had a high regard for Luther, but saw him as a starting point to be surpassed. Zeiden believed that the same critiques Calvin made about Luther, being too stubborn and believing the flattery of his circle, could be applied to Calvin himself. Calvin, like Luther, saw himself as an infallible interpreter of the Bible, and his circle's admiration, as seen in the first biographies by Beza, echoed the adulation Luther received. Calvin's life was a whirlwind of activity, and writing was just one part of his busy schedule. Born with a deep love for books, Calvin dreamed of becoming a writer. He read a lot, wrote a lot, and even had a great collection of books. But his life took a different turn when he realized the importance of his work in Geneva and Lausanne. He left his quiet study behind to help build the church and guide the people. Despite his love for writing, Calvin's days were filled with other duties. He taught people, led meetings, and was involved in many church affairs. He wrote letters, gave speeches, and was always busy with something. His main goal was to serve the people of his time and follow his calling. Writing became just one of the many things he did, but it was still very important. Calvin's words were powerful, and he preferred speaking directly to people. He believed that talking face to face was more effective than writing. But his written works, especially the Institutes of the Christian Religion and his commentaries on the Bible, had a lasting impact. These books were translated into many languages, reaching people all over Europe and even beyond. The invention of printing changed the way people communicated. It allowed books to be produced more quickly and widely, which helped spread Calvin's ideas. Calvin used this new technology to its fullest, writing and publishing works that influenced both his contemporaries and future generations. He wrote in Latin, which was the language of scholars, but also in French, making his ideas accessible to more people. Calvin was a man of his time, but he also helped shape the future. He saw the value in written works and understood that they had their own unique identity. He was aware that reading was changing, moving from being a public activity to a private one. Despite his concerns about images, he recognized the power of the printed word. Calvin's work was marked by his quick pace and his desire to get things done. He was often under stress, which affected his health, but he never slowed down. His writings, though sometimes described as embryos barely formed in the womb, were highly influential. He was productive, especially from 1550 to 1557, when he wrote many commentaries on the Bible. Calvin's approach to the Bible was unique. He believed in finding the literal meaning of the text, which was a change from the more allegorical interpretations of the past. This approach required careful reading and a deep understanding of the original languages. Calvin's work on the Bible was continuous, and he was always studying and teaching. In the end, Calvin's life was a balance of many roles. He was a writer, a teacher, a church leader, and a pastor. He used the tools of his time, like printing, to spread his ideas and serve his community. His work had a lasting impact, shaping the way people thought about religion and society for generations to come. John Calvin was a man of letters, writing and revising many important works throughout his life. His writings covered a wide range of topics, from biblical commentaries to polemical treatises, and they played a crucial role in the development of the Reformed tradition. In 1557, Calvin completed a commentary on the Book of Psalms, which he had been working on since at least 1555. This massive work of 465,000 words was a deep dive into the poetic and spiritual messages of the Psalms. Later that year, he wrote a shorter but no less significant piece, Ultima Admonitio ad J. Westphalem, which was a final warning to Johannes Westphal, a critic of Calvin's views on the Lord's Supper. This piece was 41,000 words long. In January 1558, Calvin addressed a controversial issue in Calumniae Nebulonis de Providentia cum Responsione, a 12,000-word response to criticisms of his teachings on divine providence. This work was followed by a major revision of his commentary on the Book of Isaiah, which he had started in 1559. This revision added 135,000 words to the existing 275,000, bringing the total to 410,000 words. Calvin's most famous work, the Institutio Christianae Religionis, Institutes of the Christian Religion, also saw a significant revision in August 1559. The revised version, which was 175,000 words long, was based on a total of 450,000 words. This edition was a comprehensive guide to Reformed theology and remains a cornerstone of Calvinist thought. In the same month, Calvin also revised his commentary on the Acts of the Apostles, though the exact word count for this revision is not specified. The following year, in 1560, he completed a French revision of the Institutes, which was significant for spreading his teachings in his native language. In June and December of 1560, Calvin wrote Dilucida explicatio de vera partipicine carnis et sanguinis Christi, a 29,000-word treatise on the true participation in the body and blood of Christ. This work was a response to debates about the nature of the Lord's Supper, a central sacrament in Christian practice. 1561 was a busy year for Calvin. In January, he wrote Gratulatio ad Gabrielem de Sacone, 11,500-word congratulatory letter to Gabriel de Sacone. In July, he exposed the impiety of Valentino Gentili in Impietas Valentini Gentilis Detecta, a short but powerful 3,000-word work. October saw the publication of Responsio ad Jure Sapellum Mediatorum, another 11,500-word response to a mediator's criticisms. Finally, in December, he wrote Responsio ad Balduini Convitia, a 5,500-word rebuttal to criticisms by Balduin. In 1562, Calvin continued his polemical writings with Réponse uncertain Hollandoise, a 3,500-word response to a Dutch critic. In November, he wrote Confession de joie pour présenter à l'empereur, a 7,000-word confession of faith intended for the emperor. 1563 started with Brevis admonitio ad fratres Polinos, a 2,000-word brief warning to Polish brethren, followed by Epistola qua fidem admonitionis apud Polonis, Confirmit, a 1,500-word letter confirming his admonition to the Polish brethren. In July, Calvin completed a massive 412,000-word revision of his commentary on the Pentateuch, which included a new commentary on the other 4 books of Moses. This work, Moses Libri Quinque cum Commentaries, was a culmination of years of study and teaching. The final year of Calvin's life, 1564, saw the publication of In Librum Josue Commentarius, a 54,000-word commentary on the Book of Joshua. This work was based on his sermons and teachings from the previous year. Calvin's exegetical commentaries were not just written works, but were often based on his oral teachings and sermons. For example, his commentary on the Book of Romans, completed in October 1539, was based on lectures he gave in Geneva in 1537. Similarly, his commentaries on the epistles to the Corinthians, written in 1545 and 1546, were based on lectures he gave in Strasbourg between 1539 and 1541. Calvin's sermons and lectures on the book of Isaiah from 1556 to 1558 formed the basis of his revised commentary on Isaiah in 1559. His extensive commentary on the Pentateuch, completed in 1563, was based on his teachings from 1559 to 1562. These commentaries not only reflected his deep understanding of the Bible, but also served as a guide for his followers and students. Calvin's polemical treatises were equally significant. From his early works, like Psychopannychia in 1534, which dealt with the soul's state after death, to his later works, like De Lucida Explicatio de Vera Participatione Carnis et Sanguinis Christi. In 1561, Calvin was always ready to defend his theological positions against critics and opponents. His treatises often addressed contemporary issues and debates, such as the nature of the Lord's Supper, the doctrine of predestination, and the role of the Church in society. Calvin's systematic plan, Tractatus Omnes, 1576, organized his treatises into different categories, such as instruction, refutations, and specific topics like the Lord's Supper and predestination. This plan reflected the breadth and depth of his theological and polemical writings, which were essential for the development of Reformed theology. Calvin's works were not only in Latin, but also in French, making his teachings accessible to a broader audience. For example, his Institutio Christianae Religionis was translated into French in 1541, 1545, 1551, and 1560, each time bringing his ideas to a new generation of readers. His commentaries on the Bible, such as the Book of Romans and the Epistles to the Corinthians, were also translated into French, ensuring that his interpretations of Scripture were widely understood. Calvin's legacy is not just in the words he wrote, but in the impact those words had on the Reformed tradition and the broader Christian world. His writings continue to be studied and debated, providing insights into the theological and social issues of his time, and offering guidance for believers today. John Calvin was a man of many words, and he used them to share his beliefs and explain his ideas. He wrote a lot, and his works were often translated into different languages to reach more people. Some of these translations were done anonymously, while others were revised by his friends and colleagues. Here's a look at some of his important works and how they spread across France. In 1557, Calvin wrote a short response to defend the idea of predestination. This was a controversial topic, and Calvin felt the need to clarify his views. The following year, in 1558, an anonymous French translation of this response was published, making it accessible to more people in France. Around the same time, Theodore Beza, a close friend and colleague of Calvin, revised another anonymous French translation of one of Calvin's works in 1559. Beza was known for his meticulous work and often helped Calvin with translations and revisions. In 1561, Calvin wrote a greeting to Gabriel de Saconnet, a significant figure in the Reformed community. This greeting was published in the same year, alongside a French translation of another of Calvin's responses to a critic. These works were important because they showed Calvin's support and his willingness to engage in theological debates. Calvin's commentary on the first 5 books of Moses, known as the Pentateuch, was published in 1563. This was a major work that delved deep into the biblical text. A French translation followed in 1564, making it easier for French readers to understand Calvin's interpretations. Another important work, Calvin's commentary on the Book of Joshua, was written in 1564 and also had a French translation published the same year. These commentaries were crucial for spreading Calvin's ideas and interpretations of the Bible. Before all of these, Calvin had written a small treatise on the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, between 1537 and 1540. This treatise, titled Petit Tract de las Cene, was published in 1541. It was later translated into Latin by Nicholas de Galers in 1545, making it accessible to a wider audience. Calvin also wrote a form of prayers for the Church, which was published in 1540 in Strasbourg and 1542 in Geneva. An anonymous Latin translation of this work was published in Geneva in 1552, showing the continued interest in Calvin's liturgical writings. In 1541, Calvin wrote a catechism, a guide for teaching Christian doctrine. This was translated into Latin by Calvin himself in 1545 and published in Strasbourg. The Catechism was an important tool for educating the faithful and ensuring that they understood the core teachings of the Reformed faith. Calvin's treatise on relics, written in 1543, was translated into Latin by Nicholas de Galer in 1548. This work challenged the veneration of relics, which was a common practice in the Catholic Church. Calvin argued that such practices were unscriptural and misleading. In 1544, Calvin wrote a brief instruction against the Anabaptists, a group that he saw as heretical. This work was translated into Latin by Nicholas de Galers in 1546, helping to spread Calvin's views on the dangers of Anabaptism. Calvin's Excuse aux Messieurs, les Nicodemites, was written in 1544 and published in 1549. This work addressed those who were outwardly conforming to the Catholic Church but secretly held Reformed beliefs. Calvin urged them to be more open about their faith. The Latin version, revised by Calvin, was published the same year. Calvin's dedication to his writings was not limited to the content, but also extended to the people he addressed. He dedicated many of his works to important figures, both secular and religious, to gain their support and spread his ideas. For example, he dedicated his commentary on Romans to Simon Grenius in 1539, and his Institutio Christiani Religionis, Institutes of the Christian Religion, to Francis I in 1535. Throughout his life, Calvin wrote and dedicated numerous works to various individuals and groups, including kings, dukes, and pastors. Each dedication was a way to connect with influential people and to ensure that his ideas reached a broad audience. From dedications to the pastors of Neuchâtel in 1544, to the Duke of Württemberg in 1548, and even to Queen Elizabeth I of England in 1559, Calvin's dedications were a strategic part of his work. Calvin's writings and translations were crucial in spreading the Reformed faith across Europe, particularly in France. His works were translated and revised by his colleagues, ensuring that his ideas were accessible to people in different languages and regions. Through his writings and dedications, Calvin left a lasting impact on the Reformation and the development of the Reformed tradition. The world of the 16th century was a time of great change, especially when it came to the way people read and thought about their faith. This period, known as the Reformation, was marked by a surge in printing and the spread of new ideas through books. One of the key figures of this era was a French theologian named John Calvin. Calvin's works, along with those of other reformers like Martin Luther, were instrumental in shaping the beliefs and practices of the Protestant movement. In the city of Geneva, Switzerland, Calvin and his followers worked tirelessly to promote their ideas. They used the power of the printing press to spread their message far and wide. Books, pamphlets, and religious texts were printed in large numbers, making it easier for people to access and understand the teachings of the Reformation. This was a significant shift from the earlier times when books were rare and mostly owned by the wealthy and the clergy. One of the most important books that came out of this period was the Bible. Before the Reformation, the Bible was mostly available in Latin, a language that only a few could read. Reformers like Calvin believed that everyone should be able to read and understand the Bible in their own language. This led to the creation of new translations, such as the one by Pierre Robert Olivetan, which was published in Geneva in 1535. This French translation of the Bible was a groundbreaking work that made the scriptures accessible to many more people. Calvin himself wrote extensively, and his most famous work, Institutes of the Christian Religion, was first published in 1536. This book explained his beliefs and provided a framework for the Reformed faith. Over time, it was revised and expanded, becoming a cornerstone of Protestant theology. Calvin's writings, along with those of other reformers, were not only printed in Geneva, but also distributed to other parts of Europe, including France, Germany, and England. The impact of these printed materials was significant. They helped to spread the ideas of the Reformation, challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, and encouraged people to think more critically about their faith. The printing press played a crucial role in this process, allowing ideas to travel faster and reach a broader audience. It was not just the content of the books that mattered, but also how they were produced and distributed. In Geneva, the city council and religious leaders worked together to regulate the printing industry. They established rules to ensure that the books being printed aligned with the teachings of the Reformed faith. This sometimes led to conflicts, as not everyone agreed on what should be published. Despite these challenges, the printing industry in Geneva flourished, and the city became a center for producing and distributing Reformation literature. The spread of Reformation ideas through books also had a profound impact on education and literacy. As more people gained access to religious texts, they became more literate and educated. This, in turn, helped to create a more informed and engaged population. The Reformation was not just a religious movement, but also a cultural and intellectual one that transformed society in many ways. The works of Calvin and other reformers continue to be studied and debated today. Their ideas about faith, church, and society have had a lasting influence on the world. The printing press, which played such a crucial role in the Reformation, paved the way for the modern age of information. Today, we can appreciate the impact of these early printed works and the role they played in shaping the world we live in. In this last part of the book, we look at the life and work of John Calvin, a key figure in the Reformation. Calvin was born in France and became a powerful voice for the Protestant faith. He wrote many important books, including his famous Institutes of the Christian Religion, which explained his ideas about God and the Church. Calvin spent a lot of time writing and teaching. He wrote commentaries on the Bible, which are detailed explanations of what the Bible means. He also wrote catechisms, which are books that teach people about the basics of the Christian faith. These books were used to educate both adults and children. Calvin faced many challenges during his life. He often had to deal with people who disagreed with him, and he sometimes got sick. Despite these difficulties, he continued to work hard and was a key leader in the city of Geneva, where he helped to shape the church and the community. Calvin had a personal library with many books that he used for his studies. He was very interested in the works of early Christian writers like St. Augustine and St. Bernard of Clairvaux. He also had a close group of friends and colleagues, including Theodore Beza and Heinrich Bullinger, who helped him in his work. Calvin's influence spread far beyond Geneva. His ideas were shared through books and letters, and they helped to shape the Protestant faith around the world. Even today, people still read his works and learn from his teachings.